Professor, welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, Christian.
So with all that set up, where do you stand? Are we close to or in a constitutional crisis, or are questions to that regard really legitimately being raised right now?
I think the questions are not only legitimate, but urgent. Urgent, even though we've been in a kind of slow motion crisis for really quite some time, with a president who lies regularly so that if there were an external crisis, people wouldn't know what to believe, with a president who attacks the Constitution's basic First Amendment right of freedom of speech and of the press, with a president who basically makes up an invasion and then uses our military as a political prop, with a president whose ascendancy to the office is under legitimate doubt because it really looks like he owed one, a big one, to Putin and that Putin helped him get there, with a president who mixes his business interests with his office in a way that makes it hard for us to know whether his policies toward Iran or Saudi Arabia or Turkey or Russia are driven by self-interest or not, and with the president who is determined in obvious and often public ways to commit what really are technically impeachable offenses in terms of obstructing inquiry by the justice system and by the Congress into what he did when he did it.
Okay.
So all of that is essentially the makings of a crisis. The question is, when will the pot come to a boil and will the system hold?
Okay, so you've led me right into the current boiling pot that everybody's talking about, which is the firing of Jeff Sessions. This is what he said about this in his press conference. Let's just listen.
I could fire everybody right now, but I don't want to stop it because politically I don't like stopping it. Yeah. It's a disgrace. It should have never been started because there was no crime. Everybody has conflicts. They all have conflicts over there that are beyond anything that anybody's ever seen in terms of conflicts.
So, of course, he's talking about the Mueller probe and the instinct to want to shut it down, but saying that that's not politically correct, and he probably wouldn't do it. But what do you think might happen? And particularly, he's within his rights to fire the Attorney General, to have fired James Comey, the FBI director. Isn't that right? I mean, was that an abuse of power?
Well, it certainly is an exercise of his presidential authority, but it was an abusive exercise. It's clear, even from what he said to Lester Holt on national television, that he fired Comey to shut down the Mueller probe. That is the Comey probe, which is now the Mueller probe. He fired Comey in order to ensure that someone who is loyal to him and who will agree not to go after someone like Michael Flynn is not in charge. And so even though he had the naked authority to fire Jim Comey, it was an abuse of power. Likewise, he certainly has the power to fire the Attorney General. The Attorney General serves at his pleasure. But when he fires him because he would not violate the Department of Justice regulations that required him to recuse himself, he really engages in an abuse of power. It's ironic to hear this president talk about conflict of interest. The biggest conflict of all arises with his assertion that he is the final judge of whether there was conspiracy with Russia, whether there was obstruction of justice. When he keeps saying it's all a hoax and a witch hunt, despite all of the indictments, the guilty pleas, and the convictions, he's acting as though he is judge and jury. He is trying to become not just commander-in-chief of the military, but commander-in-chief of all he surveys, commander-in-chief of the United States of America. That's an authoritarian position. And if he gets away with it, in hindsight, that will have been not only a crisis, but a catastrophe. And so the question is, will he get away with it, given that there are millions of people who seem to like his authoritarian style, who have no trouble with his racism, with his xenophobia, with the cruelty of what he says and what he does. If he gets away with it, And if the relatively spineless Republicans in the Senate, who will still control the Senate, become and continue to be enablers rather than checking him, then what we have is only the House of Representatives as a check, and it may need to rely on the federal judiciary to enforce its subpoenas. But the federal judiciary is being gradually Trumpified to the point where the U.S. Supreme Court is now composed of a 5-4 split, in which the most recent appointment was that of someone handpicked by the president because of his expressed views about the sweep of presidential power. So we are poised to see whether our system will hold. This is kind of a stress test for the constitutional system.
Well, that's obviously leads to the next urgent question. What will and how will it hold? You know, you just talked about the difference between the Senate and the current makeup of the House now. And of course, you remember that the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Mitch McConnell, refused to bring legislation to the floor of the Senate that would have protected the special prosecutor, the special investigation. That's right. Still the case. So how does one prevent, if the president was inclined, how does one protect the special prosecutor? And can the House, with its subpoena power and other power now, and its chairmanship of all these relevant committees, can it be a firewall against that?
I think the House can be a very effective, though not impermeable, firewall. If the House seeks to get testimony, for example, from the president, and to use the subpoena power to get him, courts might interfere with that. And in fact, it might well be that Matt Whitaker, who is now pretending to act as the Attorney General, and we can get to that later in our discussion, if Matt Whitaker says to Robert Mueller, I'm in charge now, I will not authorize you to issue a subpoena to the president, then we're at a Rubicon of sorts. But I think if the House of Representatives uses its powers wisely, doesn't prioritize investigation and impeachment over actually getting important measures at least enacted by one of the two houses so we can see where the problem is. If the House, for example, uses its subpoena power to ask Mueller, who probably wouldn't need to be subpoenaed, he could simply be invited to reveal all of the non-classified information that he has discovered and to share with him the conclusions, to share with the House the conclusions that he's reached, then the American people can suddenly become massively more informed than they are now. It is ultimately going to entail great popular pressure for members of the House and Senate to take steps that will protect Mueller. They will not succeed in passing a law that would protect him, partly because, as you say, Christian, McConnell wouldn't let it come to the floor. And if it came to the floor and were passed, this president would veto it. But what they can do is lay before the American people the full record of this arguably criminal administration, a record that will show that this president achieved his power by improper deals in the dark with a foreign adversary. Now, that doesn't automatically lead to his removal, needless to say. And when millions of people support him, it may be that there is no effective way to remove him. But as we saw in the midterm elections, there is an effective way to make a difference, and that is through exercising the franchise. There was a sweep across the country of new, young, diverse progressives elected to Congress, more than 100 women. It's very unlikely, even with the distortions of the Electoral College, that Trump could survive beyond the year 2020.
So let me ask you this, Professor. Professor Tribe, let me ask you, you talked about public pressure because you outlined a lot of the problems with the congressional oversight. What do you make of this public pressure by a major ally of President Trump, and that is the Rupert Murdoch-owned New York Post? Their editorial today basically said, The fear is that this is a prelude to somehow shutting down Mueller's investigation and possibly burying all its work. Won't happen. The incoming Democratic House of Representatives will have full subpoena power, and Mueller and his minions would surely cooperate rather than be silenced. Trump would be begging for impeachment and risking conviction even in a Republican Senate. He'd also pretty much guarantee defeat in 2020. So they say won't happen. Do you agree? I mean, that's a pretty powerful check on the president because he relies a lot on the support of the Post and Fox and Rupert Murdoch.
Well, I think the Post is being a bit too Panglossian. The idea that he has no chance of being elected in 2020 is wishful thinking. He does have a chance. He's not very smart in a conventional sense, but he is wily and he knows where to sink the fangs. He might well prevail in 2020. And the idea
but Professor Tribe,
that
I think they were suggesting that if he fired Mueller or shut down the investigation, that would sink his chances.
Can you imagine 67 senators in the current Senate voting to remove him from office? I think it would be very hard, even if he took the foolish step of firing Mueller. But the rather more frightening thing is he doesn't have to do that. It can be a slow motion strangling of Mueller. The guy he's put in place to supervise Mueller, Matt Whitaker, who cannot legally perform that role because of the appointments clause of the Constitution, which really in this circumstance requires a Senate-confirmed Attorney General. The guy he put in charge is someone who has publicly said, we don't have to fire him, we can just starve him out by squeezing his budget or not approving his indictments.
And can I just play that sound just so that our audience can hear him say exactly what you just said?
I could see a scenario where Jeff Sessions is replaced with a recess appointment, and that Attorney General doesn't fire Bob Mueller, but he just reduces his budget so low that his investigation grinds to almost a halt.
Well, there you are. I mean, laying out the methodology that you just said. And we have reports that Whitaker does not plan to recuse himself, as Sessions did.
He was actually, in that clip that you ran, auditioning for the very job the president gave him. From the beginning, the president said, despite all the rules that would require Sessions to recuse himself, that he really wanted his own, Roy Cohn, his protector, to be the Attorney General of the United States. So clearly, by picking a guy who pleased him on television, by really volunteering the ways in which he would undermine the Mueller probe, by picking that very guy, the way he basically picked Kavanaugh as the one person in his short list who had said that he didn't think a sitting president should be investigated or indicted. The president is basically rigging the game and stacking the deck and putting in place someone who has no intention of recusing himself.
Okay.
But the fact is that, I'm sorry, I was going to just add a little bit about why Matt Whitaker has no legal right to be in the position that he was put in, but we can get to that whenever you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said he would have to be confirmed for that position.
Right. Well, that's what Article 2, the Appointments Clause, suggests, and the favorite justice of Donald Trump, Clarence Thomas, last year wrote an opinion explaining all of that in detail. In addition to that, the administration is relying on the fiction that, in this case, Sessions resigned, creating a vacancy and making it possible to use what's called the Federal Vacancy Reform Act. But anyone can see through that. It's clear that Sessions was fired. He didn't really resign. And as a result, it violates both the applicable statutes and the Constitution's arrangement for appointing principal officers of the United States for him to occupy his position.
I have only a little bit of time left, Professor. I have only a little bit of time left, and I want to get to one other issue because it's relevant to the whole immigration debate. The president talking about ending birthright citizenship, and this is what he said to a team at Axios about his executive order ability to do that. Then I want to get your thoughts on that.
On immigration, some legal scholars believe you can get rid of birthright citizenship without changing the Constitution.
With an executive order.
Exactly.
Right.
Have you thought about that?
Yes.
Tell me more.
It was always told to me that you needed a constitutional amendment.
Right.
Guess
14th
what?
Amendment.
You don't.
You don't.
So what are the facts? Do you need a constitutional amendment? Can an executive order?
You certainly do.
Because the Supreme Court hasn't ruled on it, right?
Well, it's not exactly right. The Supreme Court did rule in the Wong Kim Ark case and in Plyler v. Doe that fundamentally the 14th Amendment guarantees that anyone born in the United States is a full citizen, regardless of where their parents came from, whether their parents were slaves, regardless of any circumstance. Birthright
Even
citizenship.
if the parents were not legal immigrants?
Absolutely. The whole point is you do not visit upon the child born here the alleged sins or even proven sins of the parent. It's a very fundamental proposition. Fugitive slaves who were violating the laws as they stood at the time of Dred Scott could have children, and the whole point of the 14th Amendment's opening language was that anyone either born or naturalized in the United States is automatically a citizen. And it's not only that you can't wipe that away by executive order. If you could wipe out the First Amendment by executive order, something that this president might want to do but couldn't do. Even with Congress's support, you can't just wipe out part of the Constitution, especially as fundamental a part as this.
Well, that's good to have that point on, because that interview left the impression that he could do that,
right.
and I'm glad we're sort of at least trying to clarify it. Now, let me ask you quickly in our remaining couple of minutes about the Second Amendment, which we all know was specifically written down by the Constitution as a well-regulated militia, etc. I just want to read you some of these stats. These midterm elections, about 24 congressional candidates who were backed by the NRA were defeated, according to some gun safety advocates, but another 88 candidates backed by the NRA did win. And in the wake of this, yet another mass shooting in under 2 weeks, where do you see that going in as we enter the post-midterm world?
Seems to me likely that the continuing drumbeat of horrifying, tragic slaughter with guns, most recently in Ventura County, before that in the Temple in Pittsburgh. The litany is too painful and long to recite. That is moving the nation's pulse on this issue. More and more people are taking on the NRA. It used to be regarded as the third rail. You can't favor sensible gun control without having the NRA bury you with money to your opponent and basically kill your political chances. That's no longer true. And the Second Amendment, even as interpreted by a very conservative Supreme Court, leaves room for banning military-style weapons and doing a number of things that would reduce, though not eliminate, the terrible pattern of gun death and gun injury in the United States. It seems to me that we have a president who is beholden not only to Saudi Arabia and to Turkey and to Russia, but to the NRA. That is not something that will necessarily stand in the way of meaningful progress.
Well, thank you so much for walking us through the nuts and bolts, the black and white of the constitutional process, and it's really helpful. Professor Tribe, thanks for joining us from Boston.